It's morning as I'm recording this, so I wish you good morning. Topics for today's class are Marxism and, before we get into that, the judicial murder of Tsui Ning. Couple things to explain about the judicial murder story. First, on page 46, the examinations are the civil service exam, which the Chinese invented. Covered the Chinese classics, was very, very difficult. And you had to go to the capital to take the exam. It didn't come to you. Roughly about 3% of the people who took the civil service exam passed it. But if you passed, you had a government job for life. On page 48, you need to understand the class system in old China, and you might want to look at the judicial murder PDF under optional student aids that outlines the 5 classes. But here's the thumbnail sketch. At the top, the most respected were the scholars, the people who could pass that civil service exam. And Lu Kuei sets out to do that. They were respected because they were the people who kept all the records, basically ran the government. And remember when we talked about Confucianism, Chinese society respects education. Below them were the soldiers. And you had to respect soldiers because they were the people who protected Chinese citizens against barbarian invasions, which were always a problem throughout China's history. The Huns, the Mongols, the Xiongnu, whoever they were, we're not sure, the Manchus, always attacking. In fact, the Chinese built the Great Wall, which is the only man-made structure that you can see from space. Beneath them, in terms of prestige, this was not about who had the most money. It's about who was the most respected. Were the artisans, the skilled craftsmen, the people who make the things on which our daily lives depend, like the computer or smartphone that you're looking at as you're watching this right now. Okay, got to respect those people because we need the stuff that they make. In 4th place were the farmers. Got to give them some respect because most of us like to eat, and they're the ones who produce that. But farming is a dirty job. When my father-in-law was raising cattle, my mother-in-law wouldn't let him come in the house until he had taken off his boots. And if you've ever been in a cow pasture, you know why. Well, the Chinese used manure as fertilizer. Farming's a dirty job. The lowest class of all, in terms of respect, were the merchants, the shopkeepers, business people. Okay? They're near the top in our society, but they were the bottom in old China because they didn't produce anything. They took the stuff that the artisans had made or the farmers had grown, bought it from them, and then turned around and resold it to other people at a markup. They're parasites. And notice Lu Kuei's status falling. You can see it in his housing. He starts off with a big house. He has to sell it and get a smaller house. And then he has to sell that and rent an apartment. And in his 2 wives. His primary wife, notice what he calls Her father, great mountain, somebody big and important. But you can also see it in his second wife, Erchia, little sister. Her father's a pastry peddler. Not only the lowest class, but the lowest rung, the lowest level of the lowest class. He doesn't even own a shop. He just has a little cart that he takes his pastries around the neighborhood to try to sell them. Now notice what Lu Kuei does for his career. He sets out to be a scholar, top group. But you got to read all that stuff. You got to understand it. You got to remember it. It's too hard. And so he winds up going into business. And look at how good he is in business. So he sets out to be the top rung in society, and he winds up in the bottom rung. Okay. And I'm going to ask you to think about what is the moral of these two stories in the judicial murder of Tsui Ning. And think about the Confucian virtues that we talked about in class the last time we actually had class. Okay. When it comes to the other thing I wanted to explain was the strings of money. That sounds kind of funny to us. On page 49, if you look at that document about judicial murder, I've got in there a picture of a Chinese coin from this time. And you notice it has a hole in it. See, their clothes didn't have pockets. And they didn't have debit cards or even checks or even paper money. It's coins. And so what they would do is they'd run a string through the hole in the middle of those coins. And a string of money was not a random amount of money. Okay, if you've ever run a cash register, you get those rolls of coins, like a roll of pennies. There's not just a random number. Every roll has exactly 50 pennies. A string of money had a specific amount. It was called a quan. Nowadays, Chinese money is in yuan. Then it was quan. And so 15 strings is 15 quan. Notice the amount. And think about, why do you suppose the father-in-law gives him 15 now and he's going to give him another 10 when he's ready to open up the store? Why didn't he just give them all at once? Look at how Lu Kuei has handled money. When it comes to Marxism, I think the explanation in your religion book is sufficient. It may help you if you look at the graphic, the Marx Viz on Canvas, also in the student aids. Make note of the date in which Mao Zedong led the Marxist revolution in China. That's going to be on your final exam. And I gave you a selection from Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto. I explained the stages of history in the religion book, but I've got a graphic there that will help those of you who are like me, kind of visual learners. It helps sometimes to have a graph that kind of shows you how one stage of history, in Marx's view, produces the next by creating the class that, when it rises up and claims a share of power, changes society. And that goes all the way through. I do want to spend a minute to talk about what Marx thinks is wrong with the stage we're in now in the West, bourgeois capitalism. Basically, the worker is getting ripped off. For Marx, the value of anything is basically made up from two sources: the value of the raw materials and the value of the labor that turns those raw materials into a finished product. Say my shirt. Let's say I bought this shirt for $20, so that's its value. And let's say the cloth that it's made from is $5 worth of cloth. Well, Marx figures then the value of the labor that turned that cloth into the shirt I could put on this morning is $15. But the factory worker who made this shirt in the factory didn't get paid $15 for making it. Let's say he gets paid $5. Well, where'd the other $10 go? It went to the factory owner. And maybe nowadays the retailer who sold it. You know, everybody gets their cut. Well, why does the worker settle for only getting paid, have to settle for only getting paid $5 for making the shirt when his labor is really worth $15? Well, the answer is that in modern industrial society, there are always more people than there are jobs. We call that difference the unemployment rate. In Marx's day, it was called surplus population, which is a scary thought, because if X number of people are surplus, then theoretically we could just get rid of them. That's dangerous. So the worker winds up having to sell his labor for less than it's worth because he can't afford the machines that you need to mass produce goods. And he can't compete making his products by hand with the price of mass produced goods. So he winds up having to sell his labor for less than it's worth, because if he won't take that job making shirts for $5 per, somebody else will. And then he and his family starve. Look also at what Mao Zedong adds to Karl Marx in order to understand Marxism specifically in China.